For 34 years, Christmas was a list of rules in my father's house. No music with a beat, no dancing, and no joy that wasn't approved. But today, the umbrella of authority has finally collapsed. I am in a new home, living a new life, and celebrating a Christmas that was once forbidden. As I count down the days to my baby's arrival this January, I am finally ready to reveal the truth behind my escape and the dark reality of the empire I left behind. My name is Jana Duggar, and my life officially starts now. To the world, it was the ultimate hit TV show, a fascinating window into a large, happy, and wholesome family. But to me, it was a 24-hour performance that never had an off switch. My life began under what we called the umbrella of authority. To an outsider, that sounds like protection. To those of us inside, it was a system of absolute control designed to break a child's will before they could even form their first sentence. We were raised under the IBLP, the Institute in Basic Life Principles. It wasn't just a church, it was a manual for human regulation. The first lesson we ever learned was blanket training. It is a memory shared by almost all 19 of us. Imagine a 6-month-old baby, barely able to crawl, placed on a small blanket in the center of a room. A toy is placed just inches away on the cold floor. The moment that baby's hand reaches out, driven by natural curiosity, they are hit with a switch or a ruler. This was not discipline. This was the systematic removal of the human spirit. By the time the TLC cameras arrived at our home in Tontatown, we were already experts at hiding our pain behind a mask of forced joy. We were governed by the Keep Sweet rule. It was the golden law of the Duggar house. It meant that no matter how tired you were, no matter how hungry, or how deeply your heart was breaking, your face had to reflect a perfect plastic smile. If you looked tired, you were labeled unsubmissive. If you showed anger, you were told you were opening a legal door to the devil. As the eldest daughter, the weight on my shoulders was absolute. While other girls my age were dreaming of college, first dates, or future careers, I was a second mother to a dozen siblings. I didn't have a childhood, I had a jurisdiction. I spent my teenage years and my entire 20s in a cycle of diapers, homeschooling, and cooking industrial-sized meals for 20 people. I never realized that I was losing my own youth to sustain my father's vision of a political and religious dynasty. We were the most famous family in America, but we were the most isolated people on earth. We weren't allowed to have friends outside our narrow circle. We couldn't listen to music with a beat. Every phone call was monitored, and every private thought was scrutinized. Perfection was our prison, and the bars were made of modesty and a silence that felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was a millionaire on television, yet I didn't have the freedom to buy a pair of shoes without permission. I was a woman grown, yet I was treated like a servant in my own home. This was the foundation of the house that everyone admired, a foundation built on the total erasure of the individual. This is segment 2. I have made the text much more descriptive and detailed to ensure it covers a full 10 to 12-minute duration when read with emotional pauses. Segment 2 in The Harvest of Secrets, duration and 100 to 2000 secrets have a physical weight. They rot you from the inside out, making every breath in that giant house feel heavy and thin. In the Arkansas's Big House, we were world-class experts at burying the truth. We had to be. In the mid-2000s, the first major crack appeared in our perfect facade, but the world wouldn't hear the echoes of that shattering for another decade. When the truth about my brother Josh's actions against his own sisters, against us, was first discovered, I waited. I waited for my father to finally be the protector he claimed to be in his sermons. I waited for him to stand up, face the darkness, and say, "This ends today. My daughters come first." But the umbrella of authority was never designed to protect the victims. It was a shield constructed to protect the brand, the ministry, and the man at the top. I remember the whispered conversations behind heavy wooden doors. I remember the cold realization that my own trauma and the trauma of my sisters was being treated like a PR problem that needed to be managed rather than a bleeding wound that needed to be healed. We were told that grace meant silence. We were told that forgiveness meant never speaking of it again. This is the ultimate cruelty of the system we were raised in. It weaponizes your own faith against you, making the victim feel responsible for the predator's survival. For years, I carried that silence like a stone in my chest. I sat on those front rows in church, wearing the modest skirts and the forced smiles, watching Josh be promoted to the face of family values in Washington, D.C. I watched him get married in a televised spectacle while we, the ones he had hurt, were left to bleed in the shadows of the very house that should have been our sanctuary. Every time a fan praised our family for being godly, it felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. Then came the year 2015, the year the world finally looked behind the curtain. When the police reports were leaked to the public, I felt a strange, terrifying surge of hope. I thought, finally, the truth will set us free. The performance is over, but I was wrong again. Instead of an apology, instead of a moment of true repentance, I was handed a script. I was coached. I was told what to say to the cameras, to save the show, to save the contracts, and to save the image. Watching my parents sit on that couch with Meghan Kelly, explaining away years of suffering as just a mistake of youth, was the moment my world finally turned to ash. I realized then, with a clarity that haunted me, that to my father, we were never just daughters. We were assets. We were pawns in a high-stakes political game he was determined to win at any cost. Our pain was nothing more than an inconvenience to his empire. The big house, with its grand staircase and sprawling kitchen, no longer felt like a home. It felt like a crime scene. The man I called Dad started to feel like a stranger, a manager who only cared about his power and his bank account. I was 30 years old, unmarried, and still trapped under his roof, realizing that the harvest of our secrets was finally here, and it was more bitter than I ever could have imagined. Oh, by the year 2019, the atmosphere inside the Arkansas house had changed. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm. The world thought the drama had settled after the scandals of 2015, but inside those walls, we were living in a house built on shifting sand. Then came that cold morning in November. I remember the air feeling thick and heavy, a strange, electric tension vibrating through the hallways. When the news broke that federal agents had raided Josh's car lot, the big house didn't just feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a sinking ship in the middle of a dark ocean. I watched my father's face as he paced the floors of that massive kitchen. For the first time in my 30 years of life, the mask of the unshakable patriarch was gone. In its place was a man scrambling to control a narrative that was finally, irrevocably, out of his hands. This wasn't a family mistake that could be prayed away in a private meeting or fixed with a scripted television apology. This was the United States government versus the secrets we had been told to keep buried for decades. We were instructed to stay loyal. We were told to stay quiet. We were told to believe that this was nothing more than religious persecution against our faith. But deep down, in the quiet, lonely moments when the cameras were off and the house was dark, the truth was scratching at the door, and it was louder than any lie we could tell. The trial in 2021 was the longest and most agonizing 10 days of my existence. I wasn't just sitting there watching a brother on trial. I was watching my entire upbringing, my entire identity, being systematically dismantled in a public courtroom. I had to sit through the briefings. I had to hear the clinical, horrific descriptions of the evidence found on those devices, evidence so dark, so stomach-turning, and so fundamentally evil that it shattered the last remaining pieces of my heart. I looked across the courtroom at my parents, and what I saw terrified me even more than the evidence. I saw them still searching for excuses. I saw them more concerned about the testimony of the family name and the future of their brand than the horrific reality of the crimes committed. That courtroom became a final battlefield for our souls. For the first time in our history, the older sisters were split. Some felt the crushing pull of the old loyalty, the fear of the umbrella, and the threat of being cut off. But others, like Jill and Jinger, had already found the courage to step into the light and speak their truth. Watching the guilty verdict being read felt like a literal earthquake beneath my feet. As Josh was led away in handcuffs, the empire didn't just fall, it vanished into thin air. The television shows, the political influence, the perfect Duggar brand, it all died in that courtroom. I walked out of that building into the cold air and realized that the man I had spent my entire life trying to please, the man whose approval I valued more than my own happiness, was just a man. He was flawed, he was blinded by power, and the system I had sacrificed my youth to protect was a lie from the very beginning. I was 31 years old, standing in the ruins of my life, realizing that the protection I was promised was actually a cage. I realized in that moment that if I didn't find the strength to save myself right then, I would be buried in the rubble of my father's house forever. After the trial, the big house became a tomb. The hallways that once echoed with the sounds of 19 children were now filled with a heavy, suffocating grief that no one was allowed to talk about. My father still expected the same level of submission. He still expected me to be the stay-at-home daughter, the one who would manage the property, care for the remaining children, and keep the secrets while he tried to rebuild the ruins of his reputation. But something inside me had fundamentally snapped. The umbrella of authority hadn't just leaked, it had been shredded by the truth. My escape didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a cinematic run through the woods in the middle of the night. It was a slow, agonizing process of reclaiming my mind, one thought at a time. I started doing things that felt like small acts of war in my father's world. I started wearing pants instead of the long, heavy denim skirts that were our mandatory uniform. I remember the first time I put on a pair of jeans. The fabric felt like rebellion against my skin. I began to look at the Bible for myself, without the IBLP study guides or my father's filtered interpretations. I realized that the God I was raised to fear, a God who cared more about the length of my sleeves than the state of my heart, was a God created by men who wanted to keep women small. Then came Stephen. I had known the Wisman family for years. Our families moved in the same tight-knit circles. But this time, it was different. For the first time in 34 years, I didn't want a courtship, that rigid, supervised process where your father monitors every text and sits in on every date. I wanted a relationship. I wanted to be known. Stephen became my secret sanctuary. We spoke for hours about things I had never been allowed to say out loud. He didn't see me as Jana Duggar, the famous daughter. He saw me as a woman who had been through a war and was looking for peace. The tension in the Arkansas house grew to a breaking point. My father could feel the control slipping through his fingers. He had already lost Jill, he had lost Jinger, and now his most loyal daughter, his right hand, was looking toward the horizon. There were arguments that left me shaking. There were lectures about loyalty and honor. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of his disapproval. I was more afraid of staying. I was more afraid of waking up at 50 years old and realizing I had never lived a single day for myself. The decision to move to Nebraska was the hardest thing I have ever done. In our world, a daughter only leaves her father's house to enter her husband's house. But I wasn't just moving for a man, I was moving for my soul. I remember the day I started packing my boxes. Each item I tucked away felt like a brick being removed from a wall. I wasn't just leaving a house, I was leaving a brand, a legacy, and a system that had owned me since the day I was born. When the news finally broke that I was engaged and moving, the public was shocked. They called it the end of an era. But for me, it was the beginning of time. On my wedding day, I chose a dress that broke every rule. It was off the shoulder, elegant, and modern. As I stood at the altar in Nebraska, far away from the big house and the cameras of my childhood, I didn't feel like a Duggar. I felt like Jana. For 34 years, I had been the girl who stayed. Now, I was the woman who walked away. I stood there, looking at Stephen, knowing that the man who had walked me down the aisle no longer owned my future. I was finally, for the first time in my life, free. No, as I sit in my new home in Nebraska, the silence is different. It's a peaceful silence, not a forced one. It is December 2025, and the world is celebrating Christmas. For the first time, I am decorating a tree without wondering if the ornaments are too worldly. I am listening to music that makes my heart dance, and I am not looking over my shoulder for permission, but the biggest miracle is yet to come. In just a few weeks, in January 2026, I will hold my first child in my arms. People ask me if I'm nervous. Of course I am, but I am also resolved. My child will never know the weight of blanket training. They will never be told that their value is tied to their obedience or their modesty. They will grow up in a house where questions are encouraged, where curiosity is celebrated, and where love is never a tool for control. I look back at the Arkansas house, that massive, sprawling monument to my father's ambition, and I don't feel anger anymore. I feel pity. Pity for the man who chose power over his children. Pity for the system that values image over truth. My journey from the big house to this quiet life in Nebraska was paved with pain, but I would walk every mile of it again. I was the eldest daughter. I was the one who stayed the longest. But I am also the one who finally broke the cycle. My name is Jana Duggar, Wisman, and my story is no longer a script. It is finally mine. The architecture of control in the Duggar family was not just built on religious sermons and modest clothing. It was constructed brick by brick through absolute financial dominance. For over 2 decades, the world watched us on television, assuming that the 19 kids and counting brand had made each of us independently wealthy. People saw the sprawling compound, the private planes, and the bus tours, and they imagined a life of luxury. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more sinister. We were international stars who had to ask for permission to buy a cup of coffee. The financial system of the big house was designed around a central core, Jim Bob Duggar. Every contract signed with TLC, every book deal, and every paid appearance was funneled through family-owned LLCs and businesses that were controlled entirely by my father. We were told this was for our protection, that the world was full of wolves who would steal our money or lead us into temptation. But as I grew older, into my late 20s and early 30s, I began to see that protection for what it really was a leash. It is a psychological trap. If you have no money of your own, you have no way to leave, you cannot rent an apartment, you cannot buy a car, and you cannot build a life outside the umbrella of authority. I remember the long nights sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the sheer scale of the work we were doing. We were filming for 12 to 14 hours a day. We were raising siblings, managing household logistics, and acting as brand ambassadors for a version of Christianity that was selling millions of dollars in advertising. Yet, when I needed new shoes or supplies for my garden, I had to present a case to my father. There was no paycheck. There was no Jana savings account. There was only the promise that the family would take care of us. This created a dynamic where obedience was the only currency. If you were a good daughter, your needs were met. If you questioned the system, the tap was turned off. The most painful realization came when I saw my married sisters struggling. I watched Jill and Jessa, women with their own families, having to fight for basic financial transparency. I saw the legal battles that began to emerge when the children finally started asking, "Where is the money we earned for 10 years on television?" My father's response was always the same: everything belonged to the ministry. But as I looked at the vast real estate holdings and the private investments, I realized the ministry was a business and we were the unpaid labor force. This financial control extended into our very identities. We were taught that debt is a sin, which sounds wise until you realize it's used to prevent you from ever taking out a loan or building credit. By keeping us financially illiterate and dependent, the system ensured we stayed trapped in the cycle. This segment of my life was the beginning of my quiet rage. I started to realize that my father wasn't just my spiritual leader. He was my employer, and he was an employer who didn't believe in paying his workers. I began to save small amounts of money in secret, cash from small jobs or gifts, hiding it away like a prisoner planning a slow escape. I knew that if I ever wanted to be free, I had to first break the financial shackles that bound me to that Arkansas soil. The concept of modesty in the Duggar household was never just about the clothes we wore. It was a psychological battlefield. From the moment we were old enough to walk, we were taught that a woman's body was a source of stumbling for men. We were raised to believe that we were responsible for the thoughts and actions of every man who looked at us. This was the modesty trap, a system that shifted the burden of purity entirely onto the shoulders of young girls, making us feel that if a man sinned, it was because our skirt was an inch too short or our neckline was an inch too low. I remember the scorching Arkansas summers where the humidity felt like a heavy blanket, while other girls our age were wearing shorts and tank tops. We were layered in heavy denim skirts and multiple shirts to ensure not a single curve was visible. We were told this was protecting our brothers, but what it really did was create a deep sense of shame about our own skin. We were taught the Nike rule, a code word that meant every male in the family had to immediately look down at their shoes if a woman who was not modestly dressed walked by. Think about the psychological impact of that. We were taught to treat the female body as something so dangerous, so volatile, that it couldn't even be looked at. In this segment of my life, I began to see the hypocrisy of these rules. The IBLP teachings were obsessed with outward appearance. We spent hours curling our hair and applying makeup because we were told we had to be pleasing to the eye for our future husbands, yet we had to be modest enough to not attract any other man. It was a confusing, exhausting tightrope to walk. My hair, which I kept long for 34 years, wasn't just a style choice. It was a crown of glory that I was told belonged to my father and eventually to my husband. I didn't own my hair. I didn't own my body. I didn't even own the way I sat or walked. Every movement was policed by the fear of defrauding someone. The most damaging part of the modesty trap was how it silenced us. When you are taught that your body is a problem, you stop trusting your own instincts. You start to believe that your value is tied to your ability to remain hidden. For decades, I lived in fear of the wind blowing my skirt the wrong way or a camera angle being too revealing. I saw how this obsession with modesty was used to cover up actual crimes. If a woman was hurt, the first question wasn't who hurt her, but what was she wearing? This culture of victim blaming was baked into the very fabric of our modest clothes. Breaking out of this trap was a slow, painful process. The first time I put on a pair of pants, I felt a wave of nausea and fear. I expected the ground to open up or my father's voice to thunder from the heavens, but instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. I felt practical. I felt capable. I realized that God didn't care about the fabric on my legs. He cared about the freedom in my heart. Shedding the denim skirts was about more than fashion. It was about shedding the lie that my body was a sin. It was about realizing that I am not a stumbling block. I am a human being. And for the first time, I was no longer hiding. The walls of the big house were thick, but they couldn't stop the truth from leaking in. For years, the world saw us as a monolith, a single, united front of 19 children who all thought, prayed, and acted exactly the same. But behind those closed doors, a silent rebellion was brewing. It wasn't a rebellion of loud shouts or slammed doors. It was a rebellion of whispers, of shared glances across the dinner table, and of secrets kept in the dark of the night. We were living in a high-pressure cooker, and the steam was finally starting to escape. This silent rebellion began in the most mundane places. It started in the laundry room, where the hum of the machines provided a rare sanctuary from the constant surveillance of the television cameras and our father's watchful eyes. It was there, amidst the endless piles of clothes, that my sisters and I began to speak the unthinkable. We started to question the umbrella of authority. We began to notice the jagged edges of the teachings we were fed every single day. We saw the blatant double standards, how our brothers were given freedom, grace, and second chances, while the daughters were held to a standard of absolute, flawless perfection. If a brother failed, he was struggling. If a sister doubted, she was rebellious. In this segment of my life, the internet became both a window and a mirror. Despite the heavy filters and the restricted access, the truth about the outside world started to trickle in. We began to see that other Christian families lived with freedom, joy, and autonomy. We saw that the world wasn't the dark, terrifying place my father described. The fear that had kept us captive for decades began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. We started using burner phones and secret email accounts. We were sharing books that were forbidden and listening to music that was considered worldly. We were deconstructing the very foundation of our existence while still sitting on the front row of my father's church every Sunday. I remember the terrifying feeling of leading a double life. To my parents, I was the dependable Jana, the one who stayed, the one who managed the house, the loyal daughter. But inside, I was a stranger to them. I was watching my father's political speeches and realizing they were built on a foundation of control that I no longer believed in. The keep sweet mask was getting harder and harder to wear. Every time I had to smile for a photo or film a segment about family values, I felt a piece of my soul dying. We weren't just a family anymore. We were a resistance movement operating in the shadows of our own home. This rebellion was lonely. It meant realizing that the people who raised you might never truly know you. It meant understanding that leaving the umbrella would mean losing everything, our home, our family, and our public identity. But the cost of staying was becoming higher than the cost of leaving. We were tired of being props in someone else's play. We were tired of the silence. The silent rebellion was the preparation for the loud departure. We were waiting for the right moment to step into the light, knowing that once we did, the big house would never be the same again. We were no longer afraid of the storm, we were the storm. The move to Nebraska was not just a change of address, it was a migration of the soul. For 34 years, my entire world was defined by the red dirt of Arkansas and the heavy wooden walls of the big house. Every tree on that property, every room in that mansion held a memory of a rule, a restriction, or a secret. Leaving it behind felt like peeling off a second skin that had grown too tight. I remember the day I finally drove away, looking in the rearview mirror as the compound grew smaller and smaller. For the first time in my life, I wasn't coming back by curfew. I wasn't coming back at all. Nebraska welcomed me with a vast, endless horizon that felt like a metaphor for my new life. In Arkansas, the hills and the trees always felt like they were closing in, as if the landscape itself was keeping watch over us. But here, the sky is so big it's intimidating. It's a place where you can see for miles, where there is nowhere to hide, and strangely, that gave me the greatest peace I had ever known. In the quiet of the Nebraska wind, the noise of my father's expectations finally began to fade. The constant internal dialogue of "is this modest enough?" or "will this please the family?" was replaced by a terrifying, beautiful silence. Learning to live in this new world was like learning to walk again. Simple tasks felt like monumental acts of independence. I remember the first time I went to a grocery store in Nebraska alone. No cameras, no sisters, no security, no prying eyes. I stood in the middle of the aisle, staring at a box of cereal, and realized that for the first time in my life, nobody cared what I bought. I was just a woman, a stranger, a face in the crowd. To most people, that sounds mundane. To me, it was a miracle. It was the first time I felt invisible, and in that invisibility, I found my true self. Living with Stephen in these early months has been a masterclass in what love is supposed to look like. In the IBLP world, relationships were built on authority and submission. But with Stephen, it's about partnership. I had spent my life caring for everyone else, anticipating the needs of 20 people before they even spoke. I didn't know how to let someone care for me. I would jump up to clean or cook, driven by a decades-old instinct of service, and Stephen would gently remind me that I could just sit down. I could just be. I had to unlearn the idea that my value was tied to how much I produced or how well I served. This transition was also a spiritual deconstruction. In Nebraska, I found a community that didn't look at me as a Duggar. They looked at me as Jana. I started attending a church where the grace was real, not a weapon used for control. I started gardening again, but this time the soil felt different. In Arkansas, my garden was a sanctuary, a place to hide. In Nebraska, my garden is a place to grow. As I planted seeds in this new soil, I realized I was also planting the seeds of my own future. The Nebraska transition was the bridge between who I was told to be and who I actually am. I am no longer the eldest daughter of a dynasty. I am a wife, a neighbor, and a woman who is finally, for the very first time, breathing fresh air. As I sit in my quiet home today, the calendar is marked for January 2026. This isn't just another month. It is the month I will become a mother for the first time. The weight of this responsibility is unlike anything I felt while raising my 18 siblings. In the big house, children were often seen as arrows for a spiritual war, units of a legacy rather than individual souls. But as I prepare for my baby's arrival, I am making a solemn vow the cycle of control, shame, and silence ends with me. My child will never know the fear of blanket training. They will never be told that their body is a source of sin or that their value is tied to their blind obedience to a patriarch. I want to build a home where curiosity is a gift, not a rebellion. For years, I was the primary caregiver for a family that wasn't mine. Now, as I prepare to hold my own child, I realize that true parenting isn't about breaking a child's will. It's about nurturing their spirit. This January doesn't just represent a birth, it represents the final death of the generational curse that has haunted the Duggar name for decades. My baby will be born into freedom. To understand my journey, you have to understand the psychological prison of keep sweet. It was more than just a rule, it was an emotional lobotomy. We were trained to believe that any negative emotion, anger, sadness, or frustration, was a sign of spiritual failure. If you cried, you were unthankful. If you were angry, you were bitter. This led to a house full of people who were experts at performing joy while their souls were screaming. In this segment of my life, I am finally learning how to be sad. I am learning how to be angry at what was stolen from me. For 30 years, I didn't know how to process trauma because I wasn't allowed to admit it existed. Breaking the keep sweet mask has been terrifying. The first time I let myself feel true anger toward the system that enabled Josh's crimes, I felt like I was breaking a sacred law. But that anger was my healing. It was the proof that I was finally human again. I am no longer a plastic doll on a television screen. I am a woman with scars, and for the first time, I'm not trying to hide them. People often ask me if I regret staying in Arkansas until I was 34. The truth is, I grieve for the girl I used to be. I look at photos of myself in my 20s, the prime of my life, and I see a girl who was exhausted. I see a girl who spent her best years changing diapers and cooking for 25 people, never once being asked what she wanted for her life. I didn't get to go to a traditional college. I didn't get to travel the world on my own terms, and I didn't get to experience the simple joy of being young and carefree. This grief is a heavy companion. I missed out on the fundamental experiences of adulthood because I was a jurisdiction of my father. I was a millionaire on a hit show, yet I was effectively a servant in my own home. I am now in my mid-30s, finally starting the life most people start at 21, but I am learning to forgive myself for the time I lost. I wasn't late. I was a captive. Every day in Nebraska is a day I am reclaiming. I am cramming decades of living into these few years, and though the loss still stings, the future is finally starting to outweigh the past. The cameras were the 1920th sibling in our family. TLC didn't just document our lives, they shaped them. We lived in a world where our most private moments, births, deaths, and courtships, were edited for maximum ratings. But the cameras never showed the tension after the cut was called. They never showed the arguments about money, the cold silences between my parents, or the absolute exhaustion of the older girls. We were a product. The Duggar brand was a multi-million-dollar industry, and we were the inventory. In this part of my story, I want to expose the illusion. The wholesome image was a carefully curated lie designed to sell a specific brand of fundamentalism to the masses. While we were filming scenes about faith and family, we were living in a house of secrets. The cameras provided a shield for my father. As long as the show was a hit, no one could question his methods. But when the cameras finally turned off, we were left with the rubble of a life we didn't know how to live without a script. For a long time, I thought that leaving the IBLP meant leaving God. My father had so closely intertwined his own authority with the authority of the Creator that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I was terrified that if I wore pants or listened to rock music, I would be struck down. But in the quiet of my Nebraska garden, I found a different kind of God. Not a God of checklists and modesty standards, but a God of radical, unconditional grace. My faith today doesn't look like the faith I was raised with. It's messier. It's full of questions. I no longer believe that my salvation is tied to my Father's approval. I have had to strip away years of toxic theology to find the truth. I realized that the Jesus I was taught about was being used to keep women in submission. But the real Jesus stood up for the marginalized and the broken. Reconstructing my faith has been the hardest work of my life, but it is the only reason I am still standing. I didn't lose my faith. I just lost the cage it was kept in. This is the end of the road for the girl the world knew as Jana Duggar. That person, the quiet, perfect, stay-at-home daughter, no longer exists. The big house in Arkansas still stands, but its power is gone. My father's empire has crumbled into the dust of public trials and private heartbreaks. As the sun sets over the Nebraska plains, I am looking toward a future that is entirely my own. I don't know what the next 50 years will hold, but I know they will be lived in the light. To anyone watching this who feels trapped by their family, their religion, or their past, look at me. It is never too late to walk away. It is never too late to find your own voice. I was the one they said would never leave. I was the one they thought was the most loyal. But even the strongest cage can be broken if you are brave enough to fly. My name is Jana Duggar Wisman. I am a survivor. I am a wife. I am about to be a mother. And for the first time in my life, I am free. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this long journey. Sharing these 50 minutes with you wasn't just about revisiting my past. It was about finally reclaiming my voice. For most of my life, I was told that my story belonged to a family, a brand, and a ministry. Today, I have proven that my story belongs only to me. The big house in Arkansas is now just a shadow in my rearview mirror. The rules, the silence, and the secrets no longer define who I am. As I look out at the vast Nebraska horizon, I don't see the limits of an empire. I see the infinite possibilities of a life lived in freedom. To anyone watching this who feels trapped in their own umbrella of authority, please know this: the cage only has as much power as you give it. It is never too late to walk away, to start over, and to find a God who loves you for who you are, not for how well you obey. As I prepare to welcome my baby this January 2026, I am filled with a peace I never thought possible. I am no longer the girl who stayed. I am the woman who chose herself. If this story moved you or gave you strength, please subscribe and share this video. Your support helps ensure that the truth stays in the light. Please leave a comment below. I'll be reading as many as I can, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most importantly, thank you for believing in the truth. I'll see you in the next chapter of my new life. Goodbye for now.